Once upon a time, there was a powerful king leading over a magical kingdom. This kingdom existed in a place so far away that the worlds of humanity were just distant rumors. And this was so far in the past that the veil was no further away than the horizon. In this kingdom, there was a great and powerful magic over the king's bloodline. When the king's eldest child became ready to rule, the old king would fade in strength and life until all of their power would pass on to their child. Until the child became ready, the king would rule, immortal, untouchable, and unimpeachable. When the child was ready, however, they would be declared a prince, and the interregnum would begin. The king would have 10 years to teach their prince all that they knew, and the prince would grow in power each day until the interregnum ended. On the last day of the interregnum, the prince would lead their parent to a quiet place at the edge of the kingdom, where they would enjoy a final sunset together. When the sun set, the old king would breathe his last breath, and the prince would have to dig a grave for their parent. Alone, the tears in their eyes as they have to move the hard, unyielding earth, separate from their family, separate from their subjects, and separate even from the strangers. Only alone, digging the grave and burying their parent, can the prince truly understand the weight of the crown. Only then can they understand the weight of the kingdom, the importance of keeping the kingdom safe, and keeping it safe for all those in it. For when a king fails, they will be all alone to dig the graves of all of those that they had failed. By accepting this humility, and letting their tears, sweat, and sadness seep into the grave with their parent, their king, their own blood, do they understand that even they, the immortal and magical kings, were not divine. When the sun rises on the day after the interregnum, the new king stands on top of the grave of the old and travels all alone to their home. They travel as a commoner for 7 long days and nights. During those days, no one knows that they are the king. They live on the kindness of others. They beg in everyone they see for another day's bread. They walk the roads that the old king had paved, and they sleep on the kingdom streets. Only when they reach the palace at the heart of the kingdom do they understand both the limits of the king and how it is to live as the most vulnerable of the kingdom. Once then, they both understand their limits and their responsibility, and finally, they understand how much they need to do. The first years of a new king are often marked by prosperity and peace. The new king, being new to immortality and often scared and scarred by their own mortality, they bring much to lead. Still, in time, the new king eventually just becomes the king. They often take one or many spouses, but the king always has an eldest child, usually by blood, but the magic is strange. Even an adopted child would, in time, become a prince, and the king would become the old king, and the interregnum would begin again. Many kings and princes had ruled over this kingdom. Good men, good women, good people. Bad men, bad women, and bad people. Oftentimes, the kings were both good and bad people. But there had always been a king, and there had always been a prince when they were ready. One king, however, sought to end this eternal cycle. King Veritas had ruled over his kingdom for centuries. He felt he had ruled justly, but he wasn't ready to die. Even after hundreds of years, the honest king could not accept his own mortality. His son, Dexter, was now ready to become a prince. He declared himself ready to the people to learn to become king. Dexter had enjoyed years of travel beyond the kingdom and into the strange worlds, both primitive primevals and uproarious utopias. He felt he had wisdom to bring to his kingdom and wanted to bring all that he learned to everyone. His father watched from his shadow, feeling his strength wane and his magic fade. One dark night, King Veritas plotted in his room to keep his immortality. He couldn't simply kill his son. To have a king shed the blood of a prince would move the bloodline to someone else, and a new king would be declared. He had to be clever, and most importantly, he had to be silent. The idea came to him the next day when he saw his executioner, one of his most loyal subjects, remove the head of a known criminal. After lifting the head to show to the screaming subjects, Prince Dexter ran up to the executioner to kiss him on the cheek. The king knew that his son loved the executioner deeply and truly. But in this, the king saw an opportunity. That night, he ordered the executioner to speak to him alone. In the dark throne room, the king, now hunched over from the weight of mortality and the weight of his crown, he ordered the kneeling executioner to kill his love. The executioner wept at the king's words. He begged the king not to. He begged to leave his love alone. He offered the king everything he owned. The king refused. He offered to the king an eternity of servitude. The king refused. The executioner finally offered his very life to the king to spare his own love, to spare the king's sons. The executioner offered his very life. The king refused. Now the night was over, and it was the last day of the interregnum. The executioner finally stood, his face down, his eyes overcast, and his heart broken. He agreed to follow the king's orders, for to disobey the king was a treason that was an eternal exile. That day, the prince and the king wandered to the edge of the kingdom. There, they were to watch the last sunset together. The old king had clear orders for the executioner. The prince was to be killed before the sun was to set. Otherwise, the executioner would have disobeyed the old king and be an eternal wandering exile. That evening, while the prince and the king sat on a log watching the sunset, the executioner approached silently. No one was around for miles. Everyone left them alone. Even the birds and the bugs could not look upon such a holy sight. But the executioner was there, with his magic axe exposed. It was a unique item, made for separating anything, eternally sharp and able to sever anything, even the immortal. For the briefest of moments, the executioner contemplated treason. When he stood behind the father and son, he contemplated saving his love, even if it meant he would never be allowed in the kingdom again, and he would likely be killed. Still, when he stood behind them, the sun setting in front of all of them, the executioner had another thought. He could do nothing. He would be a criminal, but he would be alive, and his love would live. But he would still be branded a coward, while the new king would reign. Just as the sun began to touch the horizon, and the old king took a deep, rasping breath, the executioner made his decision. He lifted his axe, and he swung it. After the sun had set, a bloody man was digging a grave with his bare hands. his tears mixed with the dirt, his heart broken as the body behind him. He dug the grave until it was deep enough both to bury himself and the body. The man cried on the bottom of the pit, contemplating keeping himself in the pit, never wanting to be found again. But those thoughts were shattered by the words of the king. That night, the king ordered his executioner to bury the late prince. By the time the sun rose, it rose over the same king that it did the day before, and a bloody, silent man. After he killed his love, the executioner did not want to ever open his mouth again. His love's blood fell in his mouth, and he did not want to give up what was left of him. That morning, the king ordered a carriage for himself and had the executioner walk to the palace. The executioner walked, never resting, never sleeping, and never eating, for 7 days and 6 nights. At the start of the 7th night, the executioner had finally made it to the palace. There, the old king was throwing a glorious feast for himself, a celebration of his eternal reign, with the interregnum ended forever. Still, though, the king had waited too long. For the king was no longer eternally young. He wheezed, he slumped, and he often misheard the words around him. Not that he cared what anyone had to say. They were all boring him with asking about his son, or why the king came back, or why was the king still alive. He was the king, and he would not answer to anyone. The exhausted executioner stood before the king, and the king ordered him to kneel. He did so without question, but also without passion. "You had served me well, my executioner. However, you have committed a great crime against me. You killed my son, you killed your prince, and you killed your love. The crime for killing a loved one is eternal exile, but I am a magnanimous monarch. For following my orders and serving me loyally, I will give you a chance to redeem yourself. If you do this quest for me, you will be pardoned from this crime and this crime alone. I require the eggs of a divine dragon. Climb the mountains and slay the dragon mother, and then bring me her clutch." The exiled executioner did not even nod, as he turned away to face his doomed quest. After climbing the mountain and slaying the dragon mother, and returning with 12 dragon eggs, the king had a grand feast eating those eggs. And he had for the executioner a burlap mask made, so that he would not have to look upon the executioner's dead expression any more. A single hole was made in the burlap sack, to let a single red eye of the executioner stare blankly at the world. The day after his 12 dragon egg feast, the king ordered the executioner into his throne room. "Well done for completing this quest for me. For loyally serving me, I have pardoned your eternal exile. However, as you know, it is a crime to slay a dragon mother, a crime punishable for a lifetime of exile. But I am a magnanimous monarch. I will give you a quest. If you can do it for me, I will pardon this crime, and only this crime, for you. One of my nobles have questioned me. They ask why I remain in charge, and I don't like it when I am questioned. I want you to slay this noble and their entire family. Start with the eldest, and then kill the next eldest, and so on until no drop of noble blood remains in this kingdom, other than my own." The exiled executioner turned and left the kingdom that very night. It took many years, but as each member of the nobility left the kingdom, often for hunts, or for breaks, or exploration, they would be killed, until finally only the noble matriarch was left. She was a day-old infant when the exiled executioner left with the mission to slay her family. When she had turned 100, she too left the kingdom into the exile's axe. When the executioner returned, there was no one left in the castle but the king himself. His guards and servants had long since died, and he never bothered to hire anyone else. This pleases me. Now there is no one left to lead anyone but me. Your old crime has been forgiven. However, as you know, it is a crime to slay a noble. And to slay a noble family, my, that is another lifetime exile. But I am a magnanimous monarch. Do a quest for me, and I will grant you a pardon for this crime, and this crime alone. And so a new cycle began. The aged immortal king, barely a living corpse covered in cobwebs on his tired throne, exiling his executioner for following his orders, and giving him another chance for another pardon, only to exile him again. The poor exiled executioner was too lost in mourning his lost love to see what was done to him, and the old king was too wrapped up in his own delusion to see that he was now ruling an empty kingdom with his last subject eternally exiled. If the king was a little wiser, he would have wondered why his executioner still lived. He would have wondered who now was carrying the last of the prince's blood. And if the king had still possessed humanity, he would have wondered what would happen if the executioner told him no. To this day, the exiled executioner still wanders. Remember that when you see him in the shadows, with his burlap mask and a single red eye following you.